I want you to just imagine a scenario for a second.
Yeah.
Picture a disease that silently stalks the country, like one that doesn't discriminate by geography, by class, or by neighborhood. It just creeps in and it steals the breath of roughly 6,000 children every single year.
Which is just a staggering number to even wrap your head around today.
It really is. But, the truly terrifying part isn't just the sheer number of lives lost. It is the sound of it. Imagine being a parent in the 1930s, sitting in the dark next to a crib, listening helplessly to this terrifying, strangling cough.
Yeah.
And there's absolutely nothing you can do to stop it.
That visceral helplessness is, well, it's something we have a very hard time comprehending today. I mean,
Right.
We operate under this assumption that modern medicine always has an answer, right? Or at least some palliative measure to ease the suffering.
Right, exactly. Like
Yeah.
a syrup or an inhaler or something.
Exactly. But in this era, the answer simply did not exist. For a parent sitting in that dark room, the medical protocol was basically to listen, wait, and just hope the child's lungs didn't give out before the bacteria ran its course.
It's just a nightmare. So today we are exploring the architecture of how we actually found an answer to that terror, and then profoundly how we almost threw that answer away entirely.
Yeah, it's quite the journey.
We have this really fascinating dossier in front of us today. We're looking at public domain history, epidemiological data from the CDC, and federal legislative records. And it's all surrounding the pertussis vaccine, which most of you probably know as whooping cough.
Right, and what's fascinating here is that it is the ultimate case study in how public confidence in medicine is built from the ground up, and maybe more importantly, how stunningly easy it is to lose that confidence.
Yeah, it really touches on everything.
I mean, we are looking at a story that involves microbiology, sociology, and even federal tort law.
So the mission of this deep dive is to explore the legacy of this vaccine through a two-part narrative. Think of it as a story in two distinct movements.
Okay.
Part one is an underdog triumph. It's the highly unlikely story of how two Depression-era women working in a local state lab, not a giant federal agency, not some massively funded pharmaceutical campus, how they developed the vaccine that ended this childhood terror.
And part two is the erosion of trust. We're going to examine how, decades later, a profound fear of that exact same vaccine triggered a massive media panic.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. It birthed America's unique vaccine court and essentially seeded the modern vaccine hesitancy movement.
Right. But before we dive in, we are laying down the rules of engagement for this exploration. Our goal here is to impartially examine the historical facts.
Absolutely.
We are going to honor the brilliant scientists who did the work, and we are going to take the very real, albeit rare, vaccine side effects seriously without minimizing them.
Yeah, that's crucial.
And we are going to objectively trace the legal and social fallout. What we're not going to do is take sides on the modern hesitancy debate.
Right. We're strictly dissecting the blueprint of how a public health triumph morphed into a public health crisis.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. To understand the total collapse of trust in the 1980s, we first have to appreciate the scale of the terror in the 1930s.
Yeah, the pre-vaccine landscape is staggering. We are talking about a disease that caused anywhere from 115,000 to 270,000 cases in the United States annually.
Just sitting with that number for a second. Up to 270,000 cases.
Yeah.
And the death toll hovering around 6,000 a year, with, a gut-wrenching 95% of those deaths being children under the age of 5.
I mean, infectious diseases were an accepted, tragic part of daily life in the early 20th century. But even among those accepted terrors, whooping cough carried a unique psychological weight.
Because of the way it looked and sounded.
Precisely. Because of the mechanical nature of the disease, pertussis actually translates to violent cough. Biologically, what happens is the bacteria attached to the cilia.
Those are the tiny hair-like sweepers in the respiratory tract?
Yes, exactly. The bacteria release toxins that essentially paralyze these sweepers and cause massive inflammation.
So the child basically loses the physical mechanism required to clear their lungs. They can't sweep the mucus out at all.
That's it. They cough and they cough and cough until literally every ounce of air is expelled from their lungs. And then, driven by pure biological desperation, they have to violently gasp for breath through a swollen airway.
Which is what produces that horrifying high-pitched whoop sound.
Right.
And this wasn't just like a bad weekend cold. The colloquial name for it was the 100-day cough.
Which is just brutal.
You have to imagine the pure physical exhaustion of a toddler enduring violent coughing fits for 3 months straight, let alone the psychological toll on the parents watching it happen.
Yeah, it's unthinkable.
So, given that we have a pathogen killing 6,000 kids a year, practically all of them babies and toddlers, common sense dictates the full force of the United States federal government would be mobilized.
Right, you'd think so.
You expect the brightest minds at the top national institutes to be handed blank checks.
Yet, the breakthrough didn't come from a federal mandate. And it didn't come with a massive grant either. It came from Grand Rapids, Michigan. The year is 1932.
Literally the absolute rock bottom of the Great Depression.
That temporal context is so vital. We are at the Michigan Department of Health, and the central figures leading the charge against this monster are Kendrick and Grace Eldering.
Okay.
They were not famous men in some highly decorated national laboratory. They were former schoolteachers who had retrained as bacteriologists, operating on an absolute shoestring budget.
I mean, they were basically moonlighting to save the world.
Yeah.
They're doing their exhaustive, routine daytime jobs at the state lab, like testing water samples, running standard diagnostics for local doctors.
Right, the daily grind of public health.
And then after hours, they dedicated themselves to pertussis. They were physically going out into the community, visiting sick children in the evenings to collect cough plates.
It is an incredibly gritty form of on-the-ground epidemiology. I mean, they would hold a Petri dish infused with a growth medium directly in front of a violently coughing child.
Just to capture the bacteria straight from the source.
Exactly. But capturing the bacteria is only step one.
Right.
The critical hurdle, which actually brings us to the third member of this legendary team, is keeping the bacteria alive in the lab.
Oh, because it dies quickly outside the body.
Yes. And that brings us to Loney Gordon, an African-American chemist whose contribution was just fundamental to the entire endeavor.
Tell me more about her.
Well, pertussis is a notoriously finicky, fragile bacterium to grow in vitro. You can't just swipe it onto a standard gelatin plate and expect a vibrant culture. It requires very specific, complex nutritional support to replicate.
So it's like trying to keep a highly specialized exotic plant alive in a sterile greenhouse. Like you need the exact right soil pH, the exact right humidity.
That is a perfect way to look at it.
Yeah.
Gordon experimented with various organic compounds and ultimately identified the precise blood-based growth medium required.
Blood-based?
Yeah, she utilized a specific preparation of sheep's blood that provided the exact proteins and iron necessary for the Bordetella pertussis bacteria to flourish.
Wow.
Furthermore, her meticulous chemical work helped identify the most virulent strains of the bacteria. Without Gordon's medium, Kendrick and Eldering simply could not have cultivated enough of the strong, standardized bacteria needed to manufacture an effective vaccine on any meaningful scale.
That is amazing. But I have to pause here, though, because looking at the structure of this achievement, something feels completely inverted to me.
Huh?
It is an incredible triumph for these 3 women at a state lab. But why on earth wasn't the Public Health Service the federal government driving this? How does a disease decimating the nation's toddlers not trigger a massive top-down federal response?
That's a great question. And it forces us to readjust our modern expectations of public health architecture.
Right, because today we just assume the CDC will handle it.
Today, we reflexively assume the CDC or the NIH will spearhead the response to a national crisis. But in the 1930s, the federal role was drastically different.
What were they focused on?
It was largely confined to maritime quarantine, border health, and overseeing interstate commerce. The federal government was quite hands-off when it came to localized disease intervention.
So the states were essentially operating as independent public health nations.
They really had to. The real engines of practical innovation, the laboratories dealing with the immediate crises of sanitation, waterborne illnesses, and local outbreaks, were the state and municipal health departments.
That makes sense.
States like Michigan had built robust departments by sheer necessity. This history underscores a fascinating reality. World-changing scientific breakthroughs don't always flow from the top of the pyramid. Sometimes they are forged on the periphery by local civil servants who are simply too close to the suffering to ignore it.
Because they were quite literally standing in the living rooms of the suffering children.
Exactly.
And what they did next elevates this from a compelling local interest story to a foundational moment in modern medical history because they didn't just mix up a vaccine, declare a breakthrough, and start jabbing arms.
No, they didn't. In 1934, they ran one of the very first large-scale controlled field trials to definitively prove the vaccine's efficacy.
To put this into perspective for you listening, today, a massive, double-blind, placebo-controlled field trial is just the baseline expectation for any pharmaceutical.
Right.
It's heavily automated, incredibly well-funded, and tracked by massive computer databases. Pulling off a large-scale field trial in 1934 during the Great Depression using paper records.
It is a methodological masterpiece. This was a pivotal moment where public health shifted away from anecdotal guesswork.
Like just giving a few kids a serum and observing that they seemed fine.
Exactly. Moving from that toward rigorous data-backed science, Kendrick and Eldering systematically tracked thousands of children. They established a vaccinated cohort and an unvaccinated control group.
All on paper?
All on paper. They maintained meticulous, handwritten records tracking exposure rates, infection rates, and the clinical severity of the symptoms if a child did contract the disease.
Coordinating with local doctors, tracking highly transient families looking for work during the Depression, all to build an airtight statistical case.
And the resulting data was undeniable. The children who received their formulation had a dramatically lower rate of infection, and those few who did contract pertussis experienced vastly milder cases.
So they basically wrote the playbook.
They really did. They didn't just invent a product. They established an early, rigorous standard for how a public health intervention should be evaluated before mass deployment.
So they have the data. They have the proof. Michigan has this bespoke, scientifically validated vaccine, but a state-level boutique operation, no matter how brilliant, can't shield a continent.
No, it can't.
The only way to eradicate a disease is to transform that local cure into a logistical juggernaut.
Which is exactly what happened. By 1940, the state of Michigan was producing and distributing the vaccine on a mass scale.
Incredible.
But the true inflection point, the moment this intervention goes from a regional success to a national cornerstone, arrives in 1948.
Ah, this is the birth of the legendary DTaP shot.
Yes. The pertussis vaccine was folded into a combined injection with the diphtheria toxoid and the tetanus toxoid.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that combination for a second, because from a public health standpoint, it's brilliant.
It really is.
Instead of relying on parents to bring their children back to the doctor for multiple separate painful injections, which drastically increases the likelihood they won't finish the regimen,
Oh, absolutely.
you deliver a single, highly effective shield against 3 major childhood killers simultaneously.
And it transformed the DTaP shot into a routine, expected pillar of American pediatric care.
The epidemiological data from the decades following that combination is just staggering. The charts show a literal cliff.
Total freefall.
We went from hundreds of thousands of cases and 6,000 deaths annually down to just a few thousand total cases by the 1980s. The sound of the whoop practically vanished from American homes.
It firmly belongs on the pedestal, alongside the campaigns against polio and measles. It fundamentally altered the childhood mortality rate in the United States.
But this brings us to the second movement of our story, and honestly, the darker psychological shift.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Because they beat the disease so thoroughly, they inadvertently created a new vulnerability. An entire generation of parents grew up having never seen whooping cough. They had no visceral memory of the 100-day cough. But the vaccine, that DTaP shot, was still a mandatory rite of passage at every pediatrician's office. And soon, the cure became the thing people feared most.
To understand how that fear took root, we have to look at the specific biology of the original DTaP vaccine. The P in that shot, the pertussis component, was what immunologists call a whole cell vaccine.
Okay, I think of the immune system like a detective trying to build a profile of a suspect, right?
I like that.
If you are using a whole cell vaccine, you are essentially dragging the entire dead body of the bacterium into the precinct and dumping it on the detective's desk.
Literally.
You are giving the immune system the entire crime scene, the weapons, the clothes, the toxins, the cellular debris. It is highly effective for making a positive ID, but it is incredibly chaotic and overwhelming for the precinct.
That is a brilliant analogy. Medically, we use the term reactogenic.
Reactogenic.
Because you are injecting the whole cell, you're introducing a massive amount of extraneous cellular material that is basically just biological noise. The immune system sees all those different proteins and antigens and mounts a very robust, long-lasting defense. But the process of mounting that defense is messy.
So it causes collateral damage in the form of side effects.
Significant side effects. We're not talking about mild soreness at the injection site. The whole-cell pertussis vaccine frequently caused high fevers.
Like how high?
High enough to be alarming. It could cause prolonged, inconsolable crying spells in infants. And, most frighteningly for parents, it could trigger febrile seizures.
Which are convulsions brought on by a rapid, intense spike in body temperature, right?
Exactly.
If you are a parent, you take your perfectly healthy, smiling baby in for a routine checkup. And then that evening, their temperature rockets to 103 degrees and they start seizing in your arms.
It's awful.
That is not an abstraction. That is a genuinely traumatizing event.
It is terrifying. Now, from a clinical perspective, those febrile seizures, while awful to witness, are generally temporary and do not cause long-term neurological damage.
But the parents don't know that in the moment.
Exactly. The subjective, visceral experience of the parent in that moment is very real. For decades, the medical establishment essentially treated this reactogenicity as the rough but necessary price of admission to keep whooping cough at bay.
And that uneasy truce held until the spring of 1982. This is the match that gets thrown into the powder keg.
It really was.
NBC aired a syndicated hour-long documentary report titled DTaP Vaccine Roulette.
Just the title alone is a masterclass in framing.
Right. Vaccine roulette implies that taking your child to the pediatrician is akin to gambling with their life at a casino.
The broadcast was incredibly powerful, emotionally charged television. It featured heart-wrenching interviews with parents who firmly believed that the DTaP shot had not just caused a temporary fever or a transient seizure, but had resulted in permanent, devastating brain damage in their children. The producers juxtaposed footage of severely neurologically disabled children with sterile shots of routine vaccine administration.
We have to carefully dissect the claims made in this broadcast because this is the hinge point of modern vaccine history. What does the scientific record actually say about those claims of permanent brain damage?
Well, we must provide a vital objective correction here. The documentary dramatically amplified the claim that the whole-cell pertussis vaccine caused permanent brain damage, a condition heavily debated at the time as pertussis vaccine encephalopathy.
Okay.
However, that specific claim of permanent damage was largely unsupported by subsequent massive epidemiological studies.
So the devastating permanent disabilities they were attributing to the vaccine on television were not scientifically proven to be caused by the vaccine.
Correct. As neurogenetics advanced, it became clear that many of the tragic neurological conditions these children suffered from were actually pre-existing underlying genetic or developmental disorders.
Like Dravet syndrome, for instance.
Such as Dravet syndrome, yes.
Yeah. And Dravet syndrome is a severe form of epilepsy that begins in infancy, right?
Exactly. And the cruelly coincidental part is that the first symptoms of Dravet syndrome typically manifest around 6 months of age.
Oh, wow.
Which happens to be the exact same window when infants receive their primary series of DTaP shots.
So it looks like cause and effect.
Yes. It was a tragic coincidence of timing, not biological causation. However, and this is the crucial nuance that gets lost, the rare reactions we discussed earlier, the high fevers and the temporary febrile seizures, were very real and heavily documented.
I want to pause on the human psychology here because it's too easy to look back with modern data and dismiss the panic. Put yourself in the shoes of a parent sitting in their living room in 1982.
Yeah.
You've never seen whooping cough. It's a phantom from your grandparents' generation. But a trusted major news network is showing you footage of profoundly disabled children, telling you the shot your doctor just recommended is the cause. How on earth is a layperson supposed to differentiate between a rare temporary febrile seizure that the doctor warned them about and the terrifying claim of permanent brain damage they just saw on TV? In the living room, a seizure looks like a seizure.
You absolutely cannot blame the parents for their reaction. It is a textbook example of how broadcast media can weaponize a real but manageable risk, the fever and temporary seizures, to sell a massive unsubstantiated fear, the permanent brain damage.
It validated the parents' deepest, most primal anxieties.
The broadcast essentially communicated your instinct to protect your child from this needle is correct, and the medical establishment is hiding the catastrophic risks from you.
And the fallout was immediate, and it threatened to dismantle the entire system. We're talking about a tidal wave of litigation.
Oh, massive. Parents organized by advocacy groups that literally formed the immediate wake of vaccine roulette began suing the manufacturers of the DTaP vaccine for tens of millions of dollars,
Claiming what, exactly?
alleging that the vaccine's defective design caused their children's neurological injuries.
When a pharmaceutical company, or any corporation for that matter, faces an avalanche of liability lawsuits, they don't look at public health charts, they look at the balance sheet.
Always. Vaccines, historically, are not massive profit drivers compared to daily chronic medications like statins or blood pressure pills.
Right, because you only take them a few times.
Exactly. A vaccine is administered a few times in a lifetime, often sold at relatively low margins to public health agencies. If the liability costs, the sheer expense of retaining corporate lawyers to fight thousands of cases, plus the potential for massive jury payouts, suddenly eclipse the profits from selling the vaccine.
The business model fundamentally collapses.
It just becomes bad math.
So what did the companies do?
In the mid-1980s, manufacturers looked at that math and decided the liability risk was untenable. Several companies simply halted production of the DTaP vaccine. Others threatened to pull out of the U.S. market entirely.
Let's zoom out and look at the terrifying convergence of events here. You have a deeply terrified public convinced the vaccine is toxic. You have pharmaceutical companies ready to throw their hands up and quit the vaccine business altogether. And lurking just off stage, you have pertussis, a highly contagious pathogen that kills thousands, just waiting for the herd immunity to drop so it can come rushing back in.
It was a perfect storm. The nation's vaccine supply chain was on the verge of total collapse.
So what does this all mean? The federal government had to step in.
They realized they had to intervene immediately to stabilize the system.
But here is the brilliant irony of this story. When Michigan faced a crisis in the 30s, they stepped in with microscopes and biology.
Yeah.
When the federal government stepped in during the 1980s, they didn't send scientists to invent a better vaccine. They stepped in with a gavel.
This brings us to the structural legislative fix. On November 14, 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, or the NCVIA.
This law completely rewired how vaccines exist in American society. Let's dig into the legal mechanics of how this actually works, because it's a fascinating piece of economic engineering.
It really is. The NCVIA created a federal, no-fault system officially called the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. Colloquially, it is known as the Vaccine Court.
A no-fault vaccine court. From a legal standpoint, how does that function compared to a normal civil lawsuit?
It functions more like an insurance pool than a traditional tort trial.
Oh, interesting.
The law imposed a small excise tax. It is currently a 75-cent tax on every dose of covered vaccine sold in the United States. That money is funneled into a massive federal trust fund.
Okay, so there's a pool of money waiting.
Yes. If a parent believes their child suffered a severe reaction or injury from a routinely recommended childhood vaccine, they do not sue the pharmaceutical manufacturer in a standard civil court.
They go to the government instead.
Instead, they file a claim against the Secretary of Health and Human Services in this specialized federal program.
And the no-fault aspect is key here, because in a normal lawsuit involving a product, you have to prove the company was negligent or that the product had a fundamental design defect that they ignored.
Exactly. In the vaccine court, the family doesn't have to prove negligence or corporate malfeasance. They only have to prove, based on medical records and expert testimony, that it is more likely than not that the vaccine caused the specific injury, referencing a specific table of known, accepted, adverse events.
And if they can prove that?
If they meet that burden of proof, they receive financial compensation from the trust fund to cover lifetime medical care, lost wages, and pain and suffering.
So the government acts as a financial buffer. But what do the pharmaceutical manufacturers get in exchange for this system existing?
They get a massive liability shield. The 1986 law made it exceptionally difficult, essentially impossible in most standard scenarios, to sue a vaccine manufacturer directly for a design defect in a state civil court.
Wow.
The federal program became the exclusive mandatory first remedy for these claims.
I want to look at the philosophy of government intervention here, because this raises an important question. In the 30s, the state's role was biological discovery. In 1986, the federal government's role is entirely bureaucratic. They didn't cure the side effects. They built an economic dam to keep the supply chain from washing away. They essentially declared that vaccines are a public good, essential for national security and public health, and that the free market, when burdened by infinite civil litigation, could not sustain them. So the government socialized the risk.
That is exactly what happened, and the legacy of this 1986 law is fiercely contested to this day, and we need to objectively examine the two distinct ways this intervention is interpreted.
Right. Let's start with perspective A, the view that the NCVIA was a masterclass in pragmatic public policy.
From perspective A, the law was an absolute triumph of governance. It achieved its primary directive. It kept the manufacturers in the business of producing vaccines, ensuring the country did not suffer a catastrophic resurgence of diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis.
It kept the lights on.
Yes. Furthermore, it created a much faster, less adversarial, and more reliable safety net for the families who truly did suffer those rare, real injuries we discussed.
Because regular courts take forever.
Exactly. In a regular civil court, those families might spend a decade fighting massive corporate legal teams and end up with nothing. The vaccine court provided a structured, funded mechanism to get them the financial help they needed.
So perspective A is that it saved the herd immunity of the nation while attempting to be compassionate to the individuals who suffered the rare statistical downsides.
Right.
But perspective B takes a much darker view of the liability shield.
Perspective B argues that the 1986 law created a dangerous moral hazard. Critics argue that by removing the threat of ruinous civil liability, the government stripped away the primary free market incentive for pharmaceutical companies to continuously improve the safety of their products.
I see. The logic goes, if a company cannot be sued into bankruptcy for a severe side effect, why would they spend millions of dollars in R&D trying to engineer that side effect out of the biological formulation?
Precisely. And it goes beyond just corporate accountability. The optics of the government granting a special legal shield to massive pharmaceutical companies fueled a deep, long-term societal mistrust.
It looks bad to a suspicious public.
To a certain segment of the population, it looked like a cover-up. It looked like the government and the corporations colluding against injured parents.
Which is a powerful narrative.
It is. And if you trace the historical timeline, the grassroots parent advocacy groups that formed in 1982, furious after watching vaccine roulette, did not just pack up and go home after the 1986 law was passed.
They stayed organized.
Those exact groups, born from the fear of the wholesale pertussis vaccine, are the direct historical ancestors of the modern organized anti-vaccine movement.
Oh, wow.
The rhetoric, the deep-seated distrust of federal health agencies, the prioritization of parent-reported injuries over broad epidemiological consensus, all of the DNA of today's vaccine hesitancy movement was forged in the fires of the 1982 DPT scare and the subsequent legal battles.
It is wild to think that the fierce controversies you see on social media right now trace their roots directly back to a local TV broadcast in 1982 about a vaccine developed in a state lab in 1932. The domino effect is staggering.
It really is an unbroken chain.
But while the lawyers, politicians, and parent groups were arguing in Washington, the immunologists actually agreed on one fundamental point.
What's that?
The wholesale vaccine was too reactogenic. They knew the high fevers and the crying spells were biologically unacceptable if a better option could be found.
Absolutely. The scientific community wasn't blind to the side effects.
Right. The legal supply was protected by the vaccine court, but they desperately needed a safer biological option to restore public faith.
And they did find one. But as we explore in our final movement, in the complex world of immunology, a safer profile doesn't always equate to perfectly enduring protection.
Right. Let's look at the 1990s and the era of the acellular switch.
U.S. health authorities knew they needed a mechanism to quiet the ongoing public fear and eliminate the real side effects of the whole cell shot. In the 1990s, the United States formally adopted the acellular pertussis vaccine.
Where did that come from?
It was a formulation that had been pioneered and successfully utilized in Japan. This new version completely replaced the whole cell component in the standard childhood immunization schedule.
So the DTaP shot became the DTaP shot, with the little A standing for acellular. What is the actual biological difference between dumping the whole cell on the detective's desk versus the acellular approach?
Well, remember, the whole cell vaccine injected the entire dead bacterium, all the proteins, toxins, and cellular debris. The acellular vaccine is a marvel of biological precision.
How so?
Instead of the whole cell, scientists purified just a few specific proteins, the key antigens like protactin and filamentous hemagglutinin, from the pertussis bacteria.
They just cherry-pick the important parts.
Exactly. They usually isolate between 3 and 5 specific components, throw away the rest of the bacterial cell, and just inject those purified proteins.
So the immune system is only being exposed to a tiny, highly curated, highly sanitized fraction of the bacteria.
Exactly. And because you've removed all the extraneous cellular garbage, the reactogenicity plummets.
I think of it like this. Imagine the old whole cell vaccine is like wearing a heavy, scratchy, incredibly thick wool coat.
Okay.
It is incredibly warm, it will protect you from a blizzard, and it will last a lifetime. But it's itchy, it's heavy, it might give you a rash, and you absolutely hate wearing it.
That's a great visual.
The new acellular DTaP vaccine is like swapping that wool coat for a lightweight, high-tech windbreaker. It is so much more comfortable, you barely notice you have it on, the fever rates drop dramatically, the crying spells mostly disappear, but...
The critical but is that the windbreaker might not keep you warm for as many years.
Which exposes the grand scientific trade-off of the 1990s.
It's one of the most significant, complex trade-offs in modern public health history. The cellular vaccine is undeniably gentler and vastly more acceptable to the public.
People weren't terrified of it.
Right. It essentially saved the pertussis vaccination program from total sociological rejection. However, as longitudinal epidemiological data rolled in, it revealed a critical flaw.
Waning immunity.
Yes. The immunity provided by the acellular vaccine wanes significantly faster than the immunity generated by the old whole cell vaccine.
Because the immune system's memory isn't as deeply entrenched, it was only shown a few purified proteins, like a mere sketch of the suspect, rather than the whole ugly bacterium, so it forgets the profile quicker.
The initial protection in infancy is excellent. But as a child gets older, moving into middle school and high school, that immunological memory begins to fade.
And the bacteria is still out there.
Exactly. Because pertussis is a highly contagious respiratory pathogen, and because it was never fully eradicated from the environment in the way polio was, the bacteria was still circulating.
Which inevitably leads us to the resurgence. The data from our sources paints a very clear picture. Pertussis quietly came back.
It did. The numbers started creeping up steadily through the late 90s and 2000s, culminating in a massive wake-up call in 2012.
Tell me about 2012.
In 2012, the CDC reported roughly 48,000 cases of pertussis in the United States.
Wait, 48,000 cases.
That was the highest number of reported cases since the mid-1950s, back before the original whole cell vaccine had fully driven the disease into the ground.
That's horrifying. Who was getting sick?
We were seeing massive outbreaks in middle schools and high schools among teenagers whose cellular immunity had waned. And the tragic downstream effect is that those mildly symptomatic teenagers would then bring the bacteria home.
And expose infants who are too young to be fully vaccinated.
Exactly. Which is exactly where the mortality risk spikes.
Looking at that data, looking at 48,000 cases, I want to push back on the decision-making here.
Sure.
From a pure biological effectiveness standpoint, abandoning a vaccine that gives robust, long-lasting immunity for one that fades in a decade seems like a massive, unforced error. It feels like a failure.
It sounds like a failure if you look at it strictly as a biological equation. But you cannot ignore the sociological variable.
The fear factor.
Yes. It is a complex public health compromise. If the government had rigidly insisted on using the old, highly reactogenic whole cell vaccine throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the public backlash might have reached a tipping point where parents categorically refused the shot.
They would just stop showing up to the doctor.
Exactly. A gentler vaccine with waning immunity that 90% of the population accepts is infinitely better for maintaining public health than a robust vaccine that 50% of the population refuses out of terror.
It completely reframes how we should think about the concept of a vaccine. We are so conditioned to view vaccines as a one-and-done silver bullet victory. You invent the shot, the disease vanishes, end of story.
But the story of pertussis teaches us that defeating a pathogen is not a finished, static victory. It is a constant, evolving maintenance problem.
Like patching software.
Exactly. Managing this disease relies on a delicate balance. It requires cyclic booster shots, which is why the DTaP booster was introduced for adolescents and adults to patch up that waning immunity. But even more critically, it relies on sustained public confidence.
You have to convince generation after generation to keep participating in the system.
You do.
Which brings us to the ultimate synthesis of our journey today. Let's recap the incredible arc we've traced.
It's been quite a ride.
We started in a shoestring state lab during the absolute depths of the Great Depression. We watched two brilliant, overlooked female scientists, Kendrick and Grace Eldering, alongside the vital chemical insights of Loney Gordon.
We saw them methodically invent and rigorously test a cure for a terror that was taking 6,000 children's lives a year.
They gave us the biological shield that changed the American demographic landscape.
Then we witnessed how the physical reality of that biological tool, the harsh reactogenicity of the whole cell vaccine, collided with modern broadcast media.
Right. A 1982 television documentary weaponized rare, manageable side effects into a national panic.
Birthing a wave of litigation that nearly destroyed the nation's vaccine supply chain.
And we saw that the federal government's answer wasn't better science, it was a legal architecture. The 1986 National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act created the vaccine court.
A structural fix that kept the medicine flowing, but, in the eyes of critics, cemented a deep-seated distrust between parents, pharmaceutical companies, and the medical establishment.
Finally, we saw the biological compromise, the pivot to the safer, highly purified acellular DTaP vaccine in the 90s.
Which quelled the immediate panic but left us with a softer immunological shield, resulting in waning immunity and a massive resurgence of 48,000 cases in 2012.
So why does all this matter to you right now as you listen to this? It matters because the legal frameworks, like the vaccine court and the social movements, specifically the organized vaccine hesitancy movement, were born directly from this exact debate in the 1980s.
These are the structures that dictate the public health world you navigate today. When you see a debate online or on the news about medical mandates, corporate liability, or parental rights versus public health, you are looking at the direct echoes of vaccine roulette.
Knowledge is most valuable when understood in its full historical context.
The true takeaway here is that maintaining a victory over an infectious disease requires something far more fragile than a vial of purified proteins. It requires an unbroken, multi-generational chain of public trust.
The story of the pertussis vaccine is the prologue to how vaccine confidence can be unraveled.
It proves that science can engineer a brilliant biological solution to a puzzle, but it cannot force a terrified society to accept that solution.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought, something I want you to mull over as you go about your day, building on the mechanisms we've explored.
Yeah.
Think deeply about that scientific trade-off between the whole cell and the acellular vaccine. If the controversial, highly reactive whole cell vaccine had never been replaced, if the public health apparatus had simply insisted we keep using the wool coat despite the fevers, the crying, and the rare seizures, its robust, long-lasting immunity might have prevented that massive 2012 whooping cough resurgence entirely. We might not have had 48,000 sick people and vulnerable infants exposed. But given the immense visceral societal backlash it was causing in the 1980s, given the tidal wave of lawsuits and the media-driven panic, if the government had forced people to endure it, would keeping that highly effective shot have completely destroyed the public's willingness to accept AMY vaccines at all?
It's a heavy question.
It really leaves you wondering, in the incredibly complex, mathematically unforgiving world of public health, which is the greater threat to our society's survival? A waning biological immunity or a waning social trust?
Yeah?
Imagine again that parent sitting in the dark next to a crib. They are no longer listening for the sound of a strangling cough, but what are they listening to instead? Are they listening to the consensus of their pediatrician? Or are they listening to a fear that was planted 40 years ago? That's our deep dive for today. Keep asking questions.